There is a moment, if you stand at the edge of the Carver Hollow on a still October morning, when the mist sits low enough in the basin that the ivy looks like a green sea, and the old timber bones underneath barely show through the surface. It looks like nothing. It looks like $40 an acre and a fool's bargain, and exactly the kind of place a person walks away from, shaking their head. Nora Vass stood at that edge on the morning she signed the back tax deed, and the mist was doing precisely that, and the whole town of Harlow already had an opinion about what she was doing with the last $408 to her name. They were not shy about sharing it. 3 years earlier, Harlow had buried Nora's grandmother on the hill behind the Methodist church, and Nora had come the long way from Cincinnati to do the carrying and the sorting and the closing up of things. She had not meant to stay. She was 23 years old and owned a set of kitchen tools, a duffel bag, a mechanical aptitude that could fix most things with a bent nail and a length of wire, and a talent for observation so thorough that people sometimes found it unsettling, the way she would go quiet and watch a thing until she understood it from the inside out. What she did not own was a future in Cincinnati that held any particular warmth for her, and so, when the sorting was finished and the house sold off for the grandmother's debts, she had stayed in a rented room above Perret's hardware store and taken odd work where she could find it, and kept watching. What she watched in those first 2 years in Harlow was the land. The town sat in a fold of low Missouri hills, and the hills were dotted with farms, and the farms were doing what farms in that county were doing in the year 1889, which was mostly surviving with their teeth in the dirt. There was good ground north of town, flat and dark, and those fields were held by the families who had held them for 2 generations and who would hold them 2 more. There was the creek-bottom ground that flooded in wet years and cracked in dry ones, and there was the hillside ground that was thin and rocky and wore out a plow in a season. And then there was the Carver Hollow. The Carver Hollow sat 2 miles east of the Harlow Square, cupped in the base of a long ridge fed by a spring branch that ran year-round. The Carver family had owned it since before the war and had done nothing with it since before the war, and old Elias Carver had died in 1881, leaving nothing but unpaid tax bills and a hollow full of English ivy that had spent 60 years doing what English ivy does, which is to say, everything. It had swallowed fences. It had swallowed the old Carver outbuildings. It had moved across the floor of the hollow in a green and seamless tide, and by the year Nora Vass arrived in Harlow, it covered 65 acres of bottomland, so completely that the county assessor had written in his ledger the single word useless and moved on to the next page. The county had been trying to sell the back tax certificate on the Carver Hollow for the better part of 4 years. No one had bid on it. The amount owed was $408. The county clerk, a tired man named Purser, had told Nora the figure with a look on his face that said he expected her to laugh. She did not laugh. She did the arithmetic on the walk home, and she did it again in her rented room with a candle stub and the back of an envelope. $408 for 65 acres of bottomland with a year-round spring branch. She lay awake with the arithmetic and turned it over until the candle went out. The next morning she went to see Augustin Molnar. Molnar was 71 years old, a Hungarian who had come to Harlow in the 1850s and whose farm lay at the base of the same ridge that cupped the hollow. He was the only person in the county who had ever spoken of the Carver Hollow with anything other than contempt, and the reason Nora knew this was that she had been watching and listening for 2 years. He had said once at the feed store, in the patient way he had of saying things that nobody paid attention to, that what grows in the darkest place grows with the deepest roots. The men at the feed store had moved on to the price of corn. Nora had filed the sentence away. She found him mending a gate. He looked up at her without surprise, as though he had been expecting her for some time. She told him what she intended to do. He was quiet for a long moment, the way an old man is quiet when he is not thinking about what you said, but about whether you are the kind of person who can hear what he is about to say. Then he said, "That ground has not been farmed in 60 years, and underneath the ivy, if you can cut it back, there is alluvial clay and leaf rot going down 3 feet, maybe more, fed by the spring, never plowed, never exhausted." He said he had walked the edge of that hollow when he was young, when the ivy was only ankle deep, and the soil under his boot had been the darkest soil he had touched in Missouri. He said, "A thing's worth is not what it shows, but what it does." Then he went back to mending the gate, and Nora walked back to town. And on the 20th of April, 1889, she paid $408 to Purser at the county clerk's window and became the legal owner of 65 acres of English ivy and hidden bottomland, and everything the hollow had been keeping to itself for 60 years. The town of Harlow delivered its verdict within the week. She heard it from the women at the dry goods counter. A girl alone could never clear that ground. It would take 20 men and 2 seasons, and the ivy would be back before the second was done. She heard it from the men at the livery. The spring branch flooded in spring and dried in August, and was not worth the name. She heard it from the hardware man whose room she rented, kindly and with genuine pity in his voice. The county had written that land off for good reason, and $400 was a hard price for a young woman to lose when she had nothing left to lose. She heard it from children who had the peculiar directness of children in such matters. Ivy ground, the Ivy Acre girl. She met all of it with the stillness she had always used when the world had an opinion she had not asked for, and she walked the 2 miles east to the hollow and went to work. The first tool she bought, on credit from Perrette with a payment schedule she had negotiated to the penny, was a good scythe. The second was a grubbing hoe. The third was a length of heavy chain, because Molnar had told her the ivy root mass could be leveraged up in sections if you chained it to a post, and used the mule's weight against it. And he had loaned her the use of a mule named Casper, who was old and slow and absolutely reliable, which was what she needed. She had also bought for $11.50 from a farmer breaking up his place east of town a small wagon and 2 pigs, because the grubbed-up ivy root mass was the finest possible thing to run pigs through, and pigs rooting through biomass do the secondary tillage better than any plow. And Nora had worked that logic out by herself in her rented room, and then verified it with Molnar, who had looked at her with something close to delight and said yes. She rose before light every morning and walked the 2 miles in the dark and worked until she could no longer see clearly. She started at the north end of the hollow, nearest the spring branch, where the ground was lowest and the soil darkest, and she cut and grubbed and chained and hauled, section by section, and the pigs followed her clearing like small pink engines, turning the root mass under. By the end of May she had opened 4 acres. Her hands had gone from rough to something beyond rough, something the skin of bark gets to, a surface that had stopped registering small pain because small pain was simply the medium she worked in. The thing she had not told anyone yet, not even Molnar, was what she had found on the 8th day. On the 8th day, cutting ivy back from the base of a limestone outcrop on the east wall of the hollow, she had uncovered the entrance to a cave, not a large one, more properly a deep overhang, perhaps 40 feet wide and 20 deep, where the spring branch emerged from the base of the rock and ran cold and clear into the hollow floor. The cave held a near constant temperature of 54 degrees in any weather. The floor was dry limestone. The air moved gently through a crack at the back. It had been sealed under ivy for so long that the interior was clean and untouched, and the moment she stepped into it and felt the cool, even air on her face, Nora Vass understood what she had bought. She walked to the center of the cave and stood very still for a long time, breathing. She had grown up reading. She had read everything in her grandmother's house, and one of the things she had read was an agricultural pamphlet from the Missouri State Board describing the cultivation of the genus Agaricus, which is to say, the common white mushroom, and the conditions it required: dark, humid free air, stable temperature, rich composted growing medium, and proximity to water. She had read it the way she read most things, with the part of her mind that filed away the useful and waited to see what became of it. Standing in the cave under the Carver Hollow with the spring branch running cold at her feet, she understood that the hollow had not merely been hiding good soil. It had been hiding an underground growing room that would have cost her $1,000 to build and that nature had furnished for nothing. That was the coal she banked low under ash. She told no one, not yet. She went on clearing. June arrived with heat that pressed down on the hollow like a flat iron, and the ivy cutting became a thing she did in sections, dawn to 10, then rest in the cave's cool, then on again from 4 until dark. She was learning the hollow the way you learn a language from the inside, by immersion, by the particular vocabulary of each day. She learned that the spring branch ran truer in the hollow than anyone in Harlow believed, because it was fed not by a surface creek, but by an underground fissure that Molnar had suspected and that she had now traced through 3 wet months without any diminishment in flow. She learned that the alluvial soil, once the ivy mass was cleared and the pigs had turned it, was exactly what Molnar had promised, dark and heavy and faintly sweet, 3 feet deep in the basin floor, the accumulated rot and leaf fall of 6 decades of untouched cover. She learned that the hollow ran 30 degrees cooler than the open fields in summer and 10 degrees warmer in November, sheltered by the ridge, and that this was the kind of microclimate that a person who knew what they were doing could press to extraordinary use. By August she had cleared 18 acres, and she had begun, quietly and very carefully, to move composted material from the ivy clearing into the cave. She had sent away for spawn, spending $7 she had earned on 3 weeks of fence mending for a neighbor, and she had laid out her growing beds on the dry limestone floor in neat rows, inoculated them, and covered them with damp burlap. She had told Molnar she was trying something in the cave, and he had asked no questions, which was one of the things she valued most about Augustin Molnar. She had also begun, on the cleared acreage, to lay out her kitchen garden plots, not the small subsistence kind, but the large, deliberate kind, because the soil was capable of extraordinary production, and she was going to give it the chance to prove this. The first mushrooms pinned in the 3rd week of September. She knelt in the lamplight in the cave and looked at the small white buttons pushing up through the composted beds, and the feeling was not triumph, not yet, but something quieter and more fundamental, the feeling of a proof that has come back correct after you were only 60% certain you had the right formula. She was alone in the cave with a lantern and a year-round spring, and 65 acres of awakening ground above her, and she let herself, just for a moment, feel the full size of what she had found. Then she covered the beds back up, went home, and slept 9 hours. Augustin Molnar came to the hollow for the first time in October. He walked the cleared ground and was quiet for a long time, his hand moving through the turned soil in the way of a man reading something written in a language he learned before he learned words. Then she brought him into the cave. He held up the lantern and looked at the mushroom beds for a long time, the rows of pale buttons in their composted earth, the spring branch running cold behind them, the even temperature that made October feel like early June. He said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he said, in a very soft voice, "What grows in the darkest place?" She said, "Grows with the deepest roots." He put the lantern down and sat on a limestone shelf, and she sat beside him, and he told her then what she would need to know about taking mushrooms to the city buyer in St. Louis, where the hotels and the restaurants and the new French-style dining rooms were paying prices per pound for fresh cultivated mushrooms that would have sounded like an error in any Harlow conversation. He had known a man who had grown them years back, before the knowledge was widely held, and he knew the names and the prices and the nature of the market with the precision of a man who had been quietly holding this information in case it was ever needed. He told her the names of 2 buyers. He wrote them in his careful European hand on a folded paper. He told her to go in autumn when the rail freight was cool enough to keep the mushrooms fresh for the 30-hour trip. He told her to pack them in damp moss, not damp cloth. He told her the price she should not accept below. She memorized everything and folded the paper and did not go to St. Louis that autumn. She was not ready. She had 3 beds and a first flush and a great deal still to learn. And she understood that the difference between a person who tries a thing once and a person who builds a thing that lasts is patience about when to show what you have. She harvested the first flush herself, pan-fried them in the hollow over a fire of ivy wood, and ate everyone standing up in the October evening, and they were extraordinary, and that was enough for now. She went back to clearing. The second winter was the winter she built the greenhouse beds along the south wall of the hollow, framed in timber she had salvaged from the collapsed Carver outbuildings, glassed in with second-hand window sash she had bought for almost nothing from a farmhouse demolition north of town, oriented to catch the winter light that came over the ridge for 4 hours a day. She grew winter greens. She grew root vegetables in the deep soil. She expanded the cave beds to 14 rows and learned the rhythm of the mushroom cycle so thoroughly that by February she could walk into the cave in the dark and tell you within a day where in the flush the beds were by the smell alone. The town had not forgotten her exactly, but its attention had moved on to other things, the way a town's mockery does when the target neither argues back nor fails visibly. There was occasional comment. The hardware man, Parrett, had asked her in November how the Ivy Acres were going, with the careful tone of a man braced to feel guilty, and she had said, "Well enough, thank you," and paid her account in full in cash, and watched his face do a quiet arithmetic of its own. She had smiled and left. It was not nothing that moment, but she was not done yet, and there was no satisfaction in a half-proof. The thing that changed everything came in the spring of 1891. His name was Edward Schreiber, and he was a buyer for the Planters Hotel Restaurant in St. Louis. A German man of about 50 with the bright assessing eyes of someone who had spent 30 years tasting things for a living and had very strong opinions about the difference between good and approximate. He had come to Harlow on unrelated business, something to do with a grain contract, and he had stopped for the night at the Harlow boarding house, and at dinner the boarding house had served, because Nora Vass had brought a sample basket to the kitchen that morning as Molnar had advised her to do, a dish of sautéed fresh mushrooms. Schreiber stopped chewing after the first bite. He ate the rest of the dish in total silence. Then he asked the boarding house keeper where the mushrooms had come from, and the keeper said, "From the girl with the Ivy Acres," and Schreiber said he wanted to meet this person, and the keeper sent a boy to Parrett's Hardware to find Nora Vass. She came in her work clothes, her hands cleaned but still bearing the permanent stain of turned earth, and she sat across from Edward Schreiber in the boarding house parlor while he told her that those were the finest cultivated mushrooms he had eaten outside of a Paris kitchen, that the Planters Hotel could absorb 50 pounds per week at a price he named, and that he could arrange a standing contract with freight accommodation if she could guarantee supply through 9 months of the year. She looked at him steadily. She did the arithmetic behind her eyes. She said she could guarantee 40 pounds per week through 9 months, and the price he had named was acceptable. And she said this with the level voice of a woman who has known for some time that this conversation was coming and has been ready for it. He shook her hand. He wrote the contract details on his card. He left on the morning train. Nora Vass walked back to the hollow in the early light and stood at the edge and looked down at the cleared ground, the greenhouse beds, the spring branch catching the April sun as it came down the ridge. 48 acres cleared now, 14 rows of mushroom beds in the cave, 2 years of work looking back at her from the south-facing glass. She thought about the $412 and about the envelope with the arithmetic on the back and about Purser's face at the county clerk's window. Then she went to check the beds, because Tuesday was a harvest day and the beds did not care about contracts. Harlow noticed. It could not help but notice. The crates going to the train station on Tuesdays and Fridays, packed in moss, addressed to St. Louis. The second mule, a young one, bought outright in May. The payment in full of her credit at the feed store. The larger things came later. The small house she began to build on the high ground at the hollow's edge in June. The timber milled from trees she had cleared and hauled herself, the walls going up one course at a time through July. The town revised its opinion in the way that towns do, not by admission, but by the slow rotation of their posture toward her, by the way people who had said Ivy Acre Girl with a certain inflection now said Nora Vass with a different one. It was Perrette who gave her the fullest account of the revision, with honest embarrassment, telling her in August that people were saying she had known something the rest of them hadn't, and she said, "I knew what soil is for," and left it at that. It was also in August that the threat arrived. His name was Croft, Fletcher Croft, and he was the regional representative of a St. Louis land and agricultural concern that had spent the last 4 years quietly buying up distressed properties in 4 counties. He came to Harlow in a good suit on a Tuesday and went first to the county records office where he spent the morning, and then to the boarding house where he took dinner, and then he came to the hollow. He stood at the edge with his hat in his hand and looked down at the cleared ground and the greenhouse beds and the spring glittering below, and his expression had the quality of a man revising a calculation upward. He came to see Nora at the house she was building. He was courteous and warm in the false warm way of men who have decided the price before they knock on the door. He said he represented a concern that was consolidating agricultural land in the region, and that her property had come to their attention as an attractive parcel. He offered her $1,200 for the 65 acres. He said it with the air of a man presenting a generous solution to a difficult situation. One person alone could not be expected to manage such an operation indefinitely. After all, it was a great deal of work for a single woman without backing. Nora looked at him. She said, "How do you know my production figures?" He smiled and said he had simply made estimates from observable data. She said, "No one can estimate what I produce from observable data without knowing the cave. Who told you?" There was a pause that was longer than it should have been, and in that pause Fletcher Croft revealed everything she needed to know about the nature of his visit and the source of his intelligence, and the name that came into her mind was the one she had already half suspected, a town official who had asked her careful questions in the spring and whose brother-in-law, she now recalled, worked for a St. Louis land concern. She had been shown the shape of the threat. She filed it away. She told Croft the property was not for sale. She told him this without raising her voice, the way you state a fact about the weather. He smiled and said he understood, and if she changed her mind, and she said she would not, and he left. And she stood in her half-finished house and listened to the sound of his hired buggy going back up the ridge road. Then she went to see Molnar. She told him everything over tea at his kitchen table, the offer, the too specific figure, the question she had asked, and the pause that had answered it. Molnar listened with his hands flat on the table, an old man's habit of patience. When she finished, he was quiet, and then he said the thing that she already knew. The concern was going to come back with pressure, not politeness. They had the capital to complicate a title if they wanted to find an ambiguity in the back tax deed, to raise a neighbor's complaint, to make the administration of her property expensive enough that she might decide to sell. He had seen this before, in other places, with other people who had built something on land that other men decided they wanted. She thought about this. She asked him, "Is the deed clean?" He said he did not know. She said she intended to find out. She went to Purser at the county clerk's office the next morning, and Purser, who had a more complicated conscience than his tired face suggested, pulled the chain of title on the Carver Hollow going back to 1831. And he laid it out page by page on his counter, and Nora Vass stood there for 2 hours and read every page. The deed was clean. The back tax certificate was properly executed and duly recorded. The title was as solid as any title in Harlow County. She had this from Purser in writing because she asked for it in writing and paid the $3 certification fee without hesitation, because $3 was the cheapest insurance she would ever buy. Croft came back in September. He came with a different tone, and a document, he said, raised a question about the proper process of the original tax certificate issuance and whether the notification period had been properly served. He said this with the patient procedural manner of a man who has done this several times before and found it effective. The document was a letter from a St. Louis attorney. Nora Vass let him finish. Then she placed on the table Purser's written certification of the title chain with the county seal, which answered every question in the document before he had finished reading the first paragraph. She watched him read it. She watched his certainty revise itself downward in real time, and the revision showed on his face the way water shows in sand, slowly and then completely. He said there might be other avenues. She said there might be, but she thought he would find them similarly arrived at, and she said this with the unhurried voice of a woman who has done the work and knows where everything stands. He left without the warmth he had brought the first time. She sat for a while with the papers on the table, and then she folded the certification, put it in the tin box where she kept her documents, and went back to the harvest. The drought came in October. It did not come to the Carver Hollow. It came to Harlow County, wide and pale and merciless, the kind of dry October that follows 3 weeks of east wind and no clouds, that turns the creek bottom pastures the color of old rope and makes the livestock nervous with thirst. The town did not feel it in October. It felt it in November, when the wells on 3 farms east of town dropped 2 feet and the winter wheat failed to germinate in the cracked ground. It felt it in December, when 4 families who had laughed at Ivy Acre Girl in the spring came to realize that they were going to be short of winter vegetables by February. The spring branch in the Carver Hollow ran without reduction. It ran because it was fed by the underground fissure, which Nora had known for 2 years, which she had taken into the arithmetic when she first walked the hollow and thought about what the land was telling her. The greenhouse beds were full. The root cellar she had dug in August, thinking, as she did everything, 2 seasons ahead, held enough stored root vegetables to feed a family through a hard winter. The mushroom cave was in full production. Hunger changes a town. It is easier to hold a contemptuous opinion of your neighbor in a year when everyone has enough, and harder when you do not. And the people of Harlow who came to Nora Vass that December came with their hats in their hands and the particular difficulty of people asking help from someone they had mocked without acknowledgement of the mocking. She could have let that difficulty sit. She could have charged what the market would bear, which in a hungry December with a year-round spring and full greenhouse beds would have been considerable. She charged fair prices. She charged the same prices she had been charging the St. Louis freight buyers, which were honest prices. And for the 2 families she knew were truly without resources, she charged nothing and carried it on no ledger, because a thing given as charity does not need an account. She sold winter greens and root vegetables and mushrooms to every family that came to the hollow through December and January, and she kept careful count of what she had and what she could spare, and where the line was between generosity and recklessness. And she did not cross it, but she got close to it, because the line between those 2 things is where the worth of a person lives. Fletcher Croft returned in January. He came not to buy this time, but to sell, which told her everything about the condition of the land concern he represented. He said the concern was adjusting its regional holdings and might have properties available at favorable prices. He was fishing. She looked at him with the steady look she had for people whose purposes had become transparent, and asked him which properties. He named 3. 2 creek bottom farms east of town, badly affected by the drought, and a piece of flat northern land whose owner had gone to his bank in November and come back empty-handed. Good ground in the right year, hard ground in this one. She made him a fair offer on the creek bottom parcel nearest the hollow. She had done the arithmetic. The creek bottom flooded in wet years, which were coming, and cracked in dry ones, which were going, and if she managed the water from the hollow's spring branch into it through a cut channel, which would cost her 2 weeks of her own labor, it would hold moisture through a dry autumn and drain properly in a wet spring. She offered what it was worth in a normal year, not what it would fetch in a desperate January, from a concern that needed to move assets. Croft accepted it without negotiation, which told her the concerned situation was worse than she had supposed. She paid in cash from the St. Louis contract revenue and did not blink. She was 26 years old and owned 89 acres of Missouri bottomland and a cave full of mushrooms and a year-round spring and a greenhouse facing south. And she had arrived in Harlow 2 years before that with a duffel bag and $408. It was Molnar who told her what people were saying that spring. He came to the hollow in the March thaw, walking the newly acquired creek bottom with her, his hands in the cold soil, reading it the way he always read soil, with the whole palm, not the fingertips. He said, "They are calling it the Voss Hollow now. Some of them, the ones who came in December." He said this without any particular emphasis, stating a fact the way he stated all facts, in the patient voice of a man who has long since stopped being surprised by the ways of towns. She said, "They can call it what they like." He said, "They mean it as a compliment now." She said she knew what they meant. She said she hoped they also meant it as a record, so that in some year ahead, when another young woman with no backing came to Harlow with eyes that watched longer than was comfortable and an idea that made no immediate sense to anyone, the town would remember the hollow and hold its verdict a little longer. Molnar turned the soil in his hand. He said, "A thing's worth is not what it shows, but what it does." She took the soil from him and felt the weight of it, dark and crumbled and fine, the 60-year-old rot of a hollow that everyone had written off in a ledger as useless. She crumbled it between her fingers. It smelled of iron and turned leaves and spring and the particular sweetness of ground that has been given time to become what it is. She said, "Yes." By May, the channel from the spring branch to the creek bottom was cut and running. The second growing season in the hollow was fully underway. And a girl of 12 named Pearl Duchamp had taken to appearing at the hollow gate on Saturday mornings with a look of absolute determination that Nora recognized as a near mirror of her own, and who, after 3 Saturdays of appearing and watching from the gate without speaking, had been invited in and shown how to check a mushroom bed for contamination, and how to read the moisture in a growing medium by the feel of it, and who had thereafter become as reliable a presence in the hollow on Saturdays as the spring branch itself. Pearl asked the names of everything. She named in return the mule Casper's replacement, a young gray they had acquired in March, and she named him something she refused to explain, and he answered to it, and that was enough. She asked about the arithmetic of the hollow with the direct curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that certain questions are considered above her station, and Nora answered every question plainly, because she had learned that the arithmetic of a place, honestly taught, is the first instrument of a person's independence. Pearl absorbed everything and asked harder questions the following Saturday and the Saturday after that. The St. Louis contract renewed in June at a higher price because Schreiber had discovered that 2 other hotel kitchens in the city would compete for the supply. Nora negotiated calmly for an afternoon over correspondence and settled on a figure that was fair and also substantial. and when she wrote the final number on the ledger page and looked at it in the evening light, she thought about Purser's face at the clerk's window, the weary resignation of a man expecting a laugh, and about the whole town's verdict delivered in the feed store and the dry goods counter and the hardware parlor. And she felt the quiet, deep satisfaction of a person who has been right in a way that required 3 years of dark mornings and cracked hands to prove. Being right is its own kind of reply. She had never needed to make another. The hollow grew. The mushroom beds expanded to 22 rows through the summer of 1892, the greenhouse beds to nearly a quarter acre, the root cellar large enough by autumn to hold a full season's storage with room remaining. She had hired 2 men from town by that point, steady men who needed the work and who did what they were told, and who, she thought, had initially found it strange to work for a woman not yet 30, and who had stopped finding it strange by the second week, because the work was organized and the pay was on time, and the hollow itself had a logic to it that rewarded attention. The logic of the hollow. That was what she had been learning from the beginning, she understood now. Not how to farm exactly, not in the general way the word implies, but how to read a specific place, how to understand what particular ground, and particular water, and particular darkness, and particular shelter were capable of, and how to give them the conditions to demonstrate it. Every decision she had made in the hollow had been a response to what the hollow had told her, from the cave's stable temperature to the spring branch's depth, to the south-facing wall where the winter light came over the ridge for 4 hours a day. She had not imposed a plan on a place. She had listened until the place revealed its own. Molnar came on a Sunday evening in September of 1892 and sat in the finished house, the walls complete, the south window looking down into the hollow basin, and drank tea that Nora had made from dried herbs she grew along the spring branch. His health had gone a little thin in the summer, nothing specific, just the gradual thinning of a 74-year-old man who has worked hard land his whole life and felt the account coming. He sat in the window's light and looked down at the hollow, the greenhouse glass catching the last sun, the cleared bottomland dark and even and full of the quiet industry of planted things, the cave mouth invisible in the limestone wall but present to anyone who knew to look. He said, "I walked that edge when I was 30 years old." He said the ivy was knee-high then, and the soil was so dark he felt it was a shame to leave it covered. He said he had not had the means or the standing to buy it himself, and that this had sat in him for 40 years as a small private grief, the grief of knowing what a thing is worth and not being able to do anything about the knowing. She said, "You did something about it. You told me." He considered this. He said that was perhaps true. She said, "What grows in the darkest place?" He looked at the hollow. He said, "Grows with the deepest roots." He said it the way you say something you have believed for a long time and are glad to see proven in the world, not because you needed the proof for yourself, but because the world needed it. They sat in the window until the light went off the glass. It is worth saying what became of certain things, as the telling of a true story requires. Fletcher Croft's land concern filed a reorganization in the St. Louis courts in the winter of 1892, a consequence of having overextended across 4 counties in a drought year, and the Harlow properties it had been attempting to acquire were sold at distressed prices to local buyers, which is to say, they went back to Harlow. Pearl Duchamp worked the hollow every summer through her 16th year, and went to the agricultural college at Columbia on a recommendation that Nora Vass wrote for her in the winter of 1895 with a specificity and conviction that the admissions committee found difficult to argue with. Edward Schreiber brought 2 colleagues from Chicago to the hollow in the spring of 1893, buyers from hotel kitchens who had heard from him about the Missouri cave mushrooms, and Nora spent an afternoon showing them the beds and the spring branch and the growing method she had refined over 4 years, and she charged them what the supply was worth, and they paid it and went back to their city kitchens, and that was a good afternoon. The hollow itself, in the spring of any year you care to name after 1891, looked nothing like the place the county assessor had written off in his ledger with a single word. The English ivy was gone from the basin floor, grubbed out and turned under, and replaced by dark cultivated ground that grew, depending on the season, winter greens or root vegetables or the careful rows of greenhouse beds along the south wall. All of it fed by the spring branch that the Harlow men had dismissed as seasonal, and that ran without pause through wet years and dry ones alike. The cave mouth, cut clean of ivy, was framed now with good timber and fitted with a door, and behind the door were 22 rows of mushroom beds in their composted earth, pinning and flushing in the dark, with the reliable patience of things that do not need light to know what they are doing. Nora Vass was 28 years old in the spring of 1893. She had 89 acres under her name. She had a standing contract with 3 city hotel kitchens. She had a house built by her own hands on the high ground above the hollow. She had rough hands and early hours, and the kind of quiet authority that settles on a person who has done the arithmetic in the dark and found the answer, and then spent 3 years proving it out in the world. The town of Harlow had settled around her the way water settles around a thing that is not going to move, not because it surrendered exactly, but because it came to understand the shape of what was there. There are places that hide their worth under 60 years of cover. There are people who look at such a place and write a single word in their ledger and turn the page, and there are people who kneel in the dark and put their hands in the soil and begin the arithmetic that no one else thought worth doing. The difference between those two kinds of people is not luck, and it is not money, and it is not the opinion of the town. It is the willingness to trust a thing that is not yet visible, and to work in the dark long enough for the evidence to come up through the ground on its own. The spring branch still runs in the Carver Hollow. It does not know who owns the deed. It does not know what the assessor wrote, or what the men at the feed store said in the year of the ivy. It knows the limestone it runs through, and it knows the direction of lower ground, and it runs toward the light the way water always does, steady and without apology, patient as anything that has roots.